Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me today. I'm here to talk to you about automating networks of any size with Ansible. And my name is Landon Holley. I'm a consulting architect with Red Hat. I've been here for about 5 years now, coming up on 5 years. And I've spent the majority of this time working on network automation projects and performing network automation feats of all scales. I have worked with small networks. I've worked with big networks. I've done, everything in between. And honestly, it's one of the most fun and enjoyable things I've ever got to do in my life. I get to talk with all sorts of interesting people and companies and teams all over the world. And I think it's just fascinating to find out who all out there is doing what with their networks and with their automation and with just anything they've got going on nowadays with the way technology is advancing so quickly. Anyway, when I'm not doing network automation in my spare time, I'm a traveler, I'm a photographer, I'm a farmer, and I'm just an all-around geek. Although lately, admittedly, the traveling thing is not really going quite so well, probably along with everyone else. But hey, in the meantime, at least I have some things to entertain myself. So we are going to talk today about getting started with network automation. And the first place we're going to talk about getting started with is fact collection. Just the facts, I like to say. And the reason we're going to start here today is because a lot of companies, a lot of teams, a lot of people who are just getting started with network automation, they have a lot of potentially different types of devices. They have a lot of different configurations. They have tons of different inventories. They may have, data centers spread all over across the world, or they may even just have a small little environment somewhere. Either way, everybody gets started kind of at the same place, and that's with fact collection. And fact collection with Ansible is going to basically allow us to do pretty much everything we need to do with our network automation and just our automation in general. A lot of people who are just starting out, they may have, a lot of things they're thinking about, a lot of ideas. And the first place to really start centering on is how can you get the most information out of your devices and out of your configurations on those devices. And the easiest place to do that is starting with facts. And from the Ansible standpoint, facts are information that is on your devices or on your OS. It may be applications you have installed. It may be versions. It may be vendors. It could be anything. It's information that is unique and interesting and important to you in your automation. And one of the first places we think about getting facts is at the very beginning of our plays, our rolls, our runs, whatever we're doing. One of the first things a lot of people often do is just gather facts initially. And this can be done at the beginning of your roles, your playbooks, basically just as the first thing you're doing. Along with that, we can set custom facts. We can go through, we can take a command, we can parse it, we can look at something that is interesting, and then we can say, this is important and I want to do something with it later. And then the last way to collect facts is with network resource modules. And these are pre-built to allow you to take any network device that you have. You could take your configuration, the base, the default configuration, you can run it through a series of parsers that will pull out all of the interesting things of that configuration. It could be interfaces, it could be accounts, whatever's on your configuration. We're trying to get Ansible to a point where you can just run it against your device and have the things that are important. So everything we're doing with fact collection essentially allows us to do everything else further down the line with our automation. Any of our commands and configs, backups, restores, provisioning, state management, updating, modifying, building, CMDBs, pretty much all of these get unlocked just by beginning with fact collection. So how do you get started with fact collection? The easiest thing to do, I mentioned a minute ago, at the very beginning of your play, you can gather facts. Now, I will caveat that prior to Ansible 2.9, it was not very easy to use native fact collection. You sometimes could, it had issues every now and then. It wasn't very consistent, but as of 2.9, we can now perform native fact collection. At the very beginning of the plays, you just say you want to gather facts, and then it will take everything on the device and it will start parsing it out for you. On the right-hand side of the screen here, you can see a little fact list. And this is essentially what will get created every time you run your fact collection. And then you can compare what was on you can compare what is the state of that device from one time to another. or just what are in my configurations from one time to another. So this can be done with gathering native facts at the beginning of an Ansible play, or it can be done by setting custom facts. And up until Ansible 2.9, custom facts was the go-to for pretty much everybody. We would take a command, we would look at what that input was, what the output was, and then we would determine what was important and what parts of that we wanted to save and do something with later. So for instance, custom fact that I have down here at the bottom, this just simply sets the device OS as NXOS. And realistically, a lot of my projects in the past have spent a lot of time building out custom facts. You would have to go through and you would have to potentially define, here are my interfaces based on a lot of regex, or here is my hostname list based on just a ton of host names that may or may not be interesting to you. You had to search for a lot of things. So one of the new and interesting things that we're able to do nowadays is just simply take the facts that we have and do something with them straight through Ansible. So there's two parts to this. The first part is native fact collection, like we've been talking about so far. So you can take information on the device, you can run commands against it, you can pull information out of that. So for instance, typically, most projects I work on in the past, at least through the past 6 months or so, have all just set a lot of manual facts. And then we've had to go through later and try to figure out, okay, here is all of our information. What do we do with it? And back in the day, the most common thing to do would be just to simply run a command, let's say show run all, something like that, show running config, whatever you need to do to get that information out of that device and do something with it. So we'd run a command, we would parse that out into a fact, and then later we would do something with that fact. Backups and restores, this is a great use case. You could just run show run all, you have the full config, set it as a fact, and save it somewhere, do something with it. Save it to an NFS share, save it to a repo somewhere. You can do anything with it. Once you have it in fact form, the world is your oyster. Now, a lot of things have changed recently because if you may notice at the bottom, I have an iOS Fax module. It's gathering a subset of config, and it's also gathering network resources. So the first part, the gather subset, that is essentially traditional iOS fact collection happening. It would be the fact module just simply getting a small group of configuration items and then handing it to you. Whereas the new network resource modules, these are full-blown parsers that will look at parts or all of the configuration and start pulling out everything related to certain things. For instance, interfaces. Back in the day, if you wanted to parse out interfaces and do something with that, that took a lot of time and effort. You would have to go through, look at your individual interfaces, determine which things in that were interesting, and then start making something with it. Whereas nowadays, the new network resource modules that we can use now, these are our ability to get config to code. So resource modules are really cool in a couple ways. They can let us take what is on our existing device and parse that out into a data model of some sort. And then we can take that data model that we just created, run it back through our resource modules, and turn that into our configurations. So this really changes things. The first few big projects I worked on, the first few, really large scale networks I began automating, they were monstrous. It took a lot of time to go through and figure out what was there, what's interesting, what do we care about, what needs to change. But nowadays, we can basically start at that same place, that same starting point that we had years ago. We can basically ramp up significantly faster because of these resource modules. So along with being able to translate data from a model to commands and vice versa, they also have the built-in logic to know which commands it needs to send. So in other words, if you're trying to configure an interface, you would need to bring the interface up and then make a change to it, or maybe you need to make a change and then bring the interface down. Regardless of which way you're trying to go there, Ansible and these network resource modules will know whether to bring it up first, make a change first, bring it down afterward. Regardless of what happens, resource modules are your ability to just define the state of what you're trying to build. They're also vendor agnostic in the sense that we are trying to build resource modules for everything. The ones we have right now are primarily targeting everything Cisco and everything Junos and everything related to those OSs. But we will be expanding that eventually. And the idea being, regardless of what sort of network device you are running, whether it's iOS, whether it's NXOS, whether it's EOS, you should be able to run a single module or a single playbook that would call a specific module based on what it needs to be calling. So in other words, you should be able eventually to run everything blindly against your network and pull back all that information. Now, in the meantime, we do still have to define, some basic things, but the end goal there is that we are trying to get automation to the point where you can determine everything that is on your network and everything that's on your individual network devices at the same time and from the same single place and putting into the same single source of truth. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like in the real world. So I recently had a chance to put some of these into use on one of my last projects, and the results were, quite frankly, great. The things that used to take weeks and potentially months to do, for a huge network with a lot of devices and having to build lots of interface configurations and templates, nowadays it makes it almost effortless. So if you take a look here on the left side of the screen, I have my interface configuration defined. These are all my variables. This is everything it could be a particular block of addresses, interfaces, or it can just be single interfaces, kind of like I pulled out here. So what I've done is I've set my interface, my description, enabled, and mode. And you can put a lot more than just those. You can define any specific interface item, and then depending on the resource module needed to execute that item, that will get pulled out automatically. So taking a look at the interfaces example on the right here, so I have name, description, enabled, and mode, the same 4 that I have set in my defaults. So the interface module is going to take a look at what all those variables are, and it's going to start looping through them and setting those as whatever they need to be, whatever I have defined them to be. So the big difference here is this, rather than just simply sending commands and hoping for the best, kind of like we used to have to, nowadays we know that if one of these resource modules executes, the change has been made and that state has been defined. And that's the big thing. This allows us to properly define the specific state of the device, of the configuration, of whatever it needs to be. So the examples that you can look at here are the very bottom right, merged, replaced, overridden, and deleted. So merged is going to be just adding or incrementing. If you have one configuration source and you want to add something to it. If you want to replace, that will be more along the lines of templating or doing a diff to see what is different between the two, or just simply taking what is there and more or less replacing it. So overridden would be forcing the configuration to change into whatever the default essentially would need to be, or you could just enforce security policy this way as well. And then the last option would be deleted, and that obviously just removes that configuration. But either way you look at it, so all of these configuration capabilities we have now allow us to define very granular capabilities granular items of state within our network configurations. So anytime that we want to, say, define a template, or anytime we want to increment the configurations on any of our devices, we can now do that very easily. So once you've ran your resource modules, what we can do then is take a look at what our facts now show. So if we make a change, if we run our resource modules, and then if we go gather facts and look at those resource modules, look at the output that those resource modules have generated, we're going to see that a change has been made. We're going to see, if you take a look at the right side of the screen here, the Ansible Facts. So you're going to see a list of your interfaces, and you're going to see those having been updated from whatever the last configuration state was. And this is really cool because this now allows us to track, any change we make, any new configuration detail, anything we add to our devices. We can now track when that change was made and what the new state of that change was afterward, or what that device was after the change. And this will really go a long way to helping people get an idea of what sorts of changes are being made to their network, and also just enforcing that the network configurations they have are correct, or at the very least are being monitored and diffed in some capacity. And then after you gather your facts, you can then use those facts in your playbooks. So taking a look at the second example here, once you have facts gathered, they'll be available within Ansible as host vars or accessible through the fact cache. Both of those will allow you to take essentially that individual fact item that you just created, whether it was a network resource module generating it, or whether it was a configuration, a set fact, something like that. Either way, all of these facts go into the data model, the fact model that we have over to the right. So you can make your changes, and you can see, from time to time, change to change, how that state has been changed each of those different times. So taking a look now at, so we have a bit of an idea now how to build some playbooks, and we have a bit of an idea of, what we can do with some of these playbooks. So the next thing we need to think about is how and where and what are we running these inventories against, these playbooks against. So the first thing that I like to do anytime that I am preparing for any sort of network project, I first start planning for my repos and my variables. And this is essentially where everything important to your automation and everything important to your network configurations will eventually live. So this is kind of a big deal. If you can define some proper standards and some proper naming conventions, you're going to be set for the most part throughout the rest of your automation journey. So the few of the big things I like to think about here, I always plan big, but start small. If I know that one of these days I may have a lot of complexity, I may not necessarily build those initial playbooks or try to prepare the repo quite to that level yet. As long as you do have standards and stuff defined, then you can just go back later and make those adjustments as necessary. But the big thing is plan big, but make sure that you start off small. You don't want to overwhelm yourself. The next thing I look at is what types of changes am I making? What are the network devices? What configurations do they have? What am I doing here? I normally break down my configurations into different layers. If you take a look at the role example that I have over to the right, the config AAA and interfaces and NTP, ACL, all of these are essentially just a different layer of your network configuration. So for the most part, I generally break down each of those layers into their own individual folder, repo, whatever that needs to be, depending on, how broad or how vast your configurations may be. But the one thing I do want to mention is, this is just one way to do it. If you have your own standards, if you have your own ways of naming these things and of, creating your own repos, do that. There's no problem as long as you can keep track of it and as long as you can go back later and make changes to it without having to, jump through hoops. That's the only thing that matters. And I have some suggestions here. So for any of our configurations, any of our different layers here, we essentially define, what is the service or the function of that thing. So in this case, config AAA. It is a configuration for AAA. Pretty simple, but having that sort of naming standard will go a long way. If you can have your own users and future users and developers looking at these and being able just to make sense of them, that will really help people adopt and pick up these new technologies. So the next thing, once we have our base repo created, we can start thinking about running that against something. And that's usually the next big discussion. We could have 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 100,000. There are any network out there, it could be any size, and it will have pretty much a unique number of network devices of different types by different vendors. Those will have configurations often vastly different from any other company and organization out there. So for the most part, I try to break down my inventories as small as I can and as simple as I can, at least to start. And I usually do that by supplying the Ansible network OS variable that's needed to run any of our automation against network devices. I usually supply that as my main inventory group. So that may be iOS or NXOS, F5, whatever that may be. And that will also allow us to just simply pass through that inventory variable into our playbooks. So if you know that you're running your iOS inventory, you can just call out your Ansible network OS as your target for your inventory and for the jobs that are running against that inventory. So separate from that, there's 4 different things we need to get started with basic, running a playbook. The Ansible hostname, obviously, you need an IP or an FQDN. I normally go for the FQDN, domain name, just because if you can, DNS is a great thing to be able to use. But it also, it also will allow IP addresses. So if you have a domain name or an IP, you're fine. And then username, password, obviously, and again, network OS. Those 4 things will allow Ansible to connect to any device and start running things against it. Now, separate from that, I often have a lot of other variables that I include, and I often stick these straight in the inventory or host vars so that outside of playbooks, these can be accessed anytime they need. So device family, device type, model, serial, geo, location, zone, rack, all of these would be great to have. You can use these variables to help build your logic and conditionals within your playbooks, and then you can tie those into workflows, or you could tie it into Ansible Facts somewhere down the line. There's a lot of options here. But again, think big, plan big. Think big, plan, I forget what it is. Anyway, plan for having a bunch of different type of inventories and variables, but do start small with them. Don't jump too far ahead. And then looking at what to do then, maybe you now have your first group of playbooks and roles, and you're trying to figure out what to do with them now, now that I can run something against my inventories. So one of the things I like to do is build tower workflows. And these allow you to take just separate jobs within a tower role, within a role, and run them through tower. So in this case, provisioning makes a great example. You can SSH into a serial console and then log into a device. You apply your base layer and then log in a second time with that new local password that you just supplied. And then set up AAA and then log in again with your new user credential and then finish your configuration. All that can be automated very easily nowadays through a tower workflow. So you can essentially have a deployment pipeline for your network automation configurations or for the actual device provisioning itself. And similar to that, I often am building CI/CD workflows that will let people take the specific network changes they're making their configurations and either test them or automatically merge them up to some sort of other repo or some other higher level. And a lot of times that works out very simply, just as being able to clone a repo, make some changes to it, do some linting, maybe run it in check mode to make sure that the things you just wrote actually work and are functional. And then based on that success, run it in the real world, run it in production, whatever that needs to be. Commit those changes, push them up, merge them, and then check out the next branch and rinse and repeat that whole process. So both of these are really great starting points for, actually doing something real with your network automation now that you've gotten started with it. So now that we have talked a little bit about actually getting started with Ansible, let's talk a little bit about what happens once you're into doing Ansible at perhaps a higher scale or just perhaps a deeper level of development complexity. So one of the big things to think about going forward, any sort of start you have to your network automation, you are going to be adding complexity and size and potentially all sorts of data to Ansible, to Tower, to your own CMDBs, whatever that may be. I like to say that Ansible is a gateway to a big data project. You could potentially get a lot of data that you have to do something with. So what I often do is start by trying to determine what is my fact collection schedule going to be. Usually, if I'm starting a new project, fact collection is happening, but it isn't necessarily super in-depth or necessarily getting a ton of data. It can. Sometimes you can just dive right into it. But I often like to start small, perhaps gathering parts of configurations rather than the configuration of the full configuration itself. Or I often look at how often fact collection actually needs to happen. Is it something that's static or is it something that's dynamic and often changing? Things like AAA or interfaces, two very different things. AAA may never change once a year, perhaps once a quarter, depending on password rotations. Or you could have things like interfaces that may be changing daily or hourly, depending on what your environment is doing. So all of these will play into, how often you need to run fact collection and the resource contention that fact collection will cause. Now, once we actually have fact collection running, I highly suggest running a set fact of some sort that will take parts of your configurations that you can then reference and use and compare against in memory. Idea being, if you can reduce the number of individual commands that get sent back and forth from Ansible to the network device, back to Ansible, back to the network device, that's going to save you a lot of time and effort and energy. It will also reduce the amount of database access needed. The less you can minimize your database usage, the faster and overall more quickly you'll be able to get data in and out of Tower. The next thing I like to think about is my Tower architecture. Do I need to be looking at container groups or instance groups, perhaps? So the two big differences there. Instance groups are essentially standard Tower nodes. They are usually VMs, they may be physical, whatever. They're pretty much generic Tower instances like we've been using all over the place for the past few years. Container groups are somewhat new, and these will allow you to deploy Tower resources and run jobs on containers as opposed to a dedicated virtual resource or a physical resource. So these will allow you to scale, container groups will allow you to scale up and down very quickly and easily. So if you were looking at doing a high volume of fact collection, or if your automation is simply long and complex, I would highly suggest looking at container groups. Or I would suggest taking your instance groups and perhaps breaking those out so you could have your fact collection happening on a dedicated instance group instead of consuming all the resources for your full cluster. And then the next thing I would think about is offloading all of your fact searching and fact or playbook analytics to a tool like Elk or Splunk or Cosmos DB, something where you can put all this data, potentially a ton of data, and start scaling out that search and analytics capability elsewhere. Ansible and Tower are great for being able to find and do something with that information. But if you're trying to run a large number of jobs while also searching through things in the fact cache or trying to correlate multiple different data points within Ansible, then you can start seeing things slow down. So I would highly suggest offloading your search and analytics to something else. And then kind of the last point here I mentioned a minute ago, but facts and logs are a gateway to big data projects. You are going to potentially getting a lot of data back. And a lot of teams that I've worked with have kind of been overwhelmed by that. So another thing to think about is you don't necessarily need to immediately start doing things with this data. There will be a lot, and you potentially won't care about a lot of that right off the bat. And that's okay. A lot of people I talk to are very worried about, trying to do all of this from the ground up at the very beginning of the project, trying to just scope it all out. And these things take time. It will take a while for you to build out your first batch of playbooks. It will take you a little while to figure out, what your end goal is in terms of, now that I have this, what did this just unlock for me? Things may change a lot there. So don't worry too much about trying to do everything from the ground up. So to wrap up here, there are some learning resources that I would like to point you all to. The networking workshops that we host from time to time, you can find a lot of these on GitHub. And these are great just to get started, trying to kind of learn a little bit about Ansible itself, trying to get started with some basic network things, pulling down a simple config, doing backups and restores. We kind of step through all of those details, kind of step by step, lab by lab. So I would highly suggest taking a look at the network workshops. Along with that, if you have any interest in learning more about resource modules, my coworker Trishna did a great talk at last year's Ansible Fest. She did a deep dive on anything and everything about resource modules. She is one of the lead engineers over that initiative, and she knows everything there is about them. So please check that out if you'd like to know more. And then the last thing is we have certification and formal training available. If you are looking for something, a little more formalized, a little more standardized, or if you're just looking for kind of the deep dive into all of Ansible and networking and development and standards and everything we've just talked about, then the certification and our official training classes will have all of that in much, much, much more detail and to basically your heart's content. You can learn everything you need to there. And I think that is it. So thank you all very much for joining me today. I know we've covered a lot of information. I know there's been a lot of details to try to take in, but I thank you for joining, and please take care. And thank you.
Landon-san, thank you for your presentation. I think this is very comprehensive from the getting started with the Fax and explanation about the resource module and many other details, information around the inventories and the CI/CD process to scaling in terms of the architecture and also database. Many information we've got today. Thank you for that. So we've got several questions from the registrants to the Ansible Automates Tokyo. I would like to go through several questions, and I would like you to answer as many as you can in 10 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, this is from someone, and I know the United States also have faced the COVID-19, and many of the operation engineers, IT engineers in network is not cannot go into the office or the data center. How do you see that the network engineer in the United States adapting this situation? For example, they are very much okay with it because they are ready to be a CI/CD environment workflow, or maybe Git. They have many playbooks in Git, so they can work. Several person can work to operate in network operation.
Yep. So this has been one of the biggest things that I've seen over the past, 2-3 months or so, is just the sheer number of people who have never had to do something like this before. Mm-hmm. I'm lucky that I've been working remote for about 5 years now, and admittedly, I am now teaching and talking to all of my projects and colleagues about how to be a remote worker. It's not as simple as just showing up to an office and doing things. You don't have, I say almost, you don't have the luxury anymore of being able to have a routine quite like some people may have used to before. So I have been telling people basically to do anything and everything they can to automate everything they do. On the network side, a lot of people are still doing a lot of copy and paste, or using Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, things like that. Even just simply using Ansible to call an Excel spreadsheet and use it at that point is taking the human, removing the human, removing, our capacity to cause problems, removing that from the equation. So I've been basically suggesting to people all the things I used to do when I first started getting into automation. Start small, take the little things you do on a daily basis, copy and paste, slide that over to a little Ansible playbook that does the same thing. Or big scripts, things that take a long time to run, you may have to run a lot of, use Ansible and create a wrapper to call those other things. Pretty much anything you can do to prevent simple mistakes from happening. Because right now, if something big were to happen, you can't just go down to a data center and reset the device, plug it back in. You have to be very careful. So that's the big thing, in my opinion, is just trying to prevent ourselves. I try to prevent myself from messing up my own job.
That's great. Going to next questions, and this is in Japan, many network engineer, maybe this is same in United States, but this person's environment is based on manual operation, and architecture is based on that. And also the operation workflow is also like a waterfall model from top to down. And there are many costs in terms of people and maybe time. So in this environment, he or she wants to start automating network environment. What type of task or operation do you think to start with. This person wants to start with configuration management, which is done by manual, but maybe he or she is struggling to choose which part of the operation to automate first.
Gotcha. Yeah. And this is the thing I talk about on every project. Everybody that I talk to, anybody who's been doing networking for a long time or just getting into it, this is always, where do you start? What do you do? I on any project, on any network I work on, I pretty much always do the same few things. The very first thing I do is I run simple fact gathering, fact collection against as many things in the network, in the inventory as you possibly can. At the very least, do a show run all or get a simple configuration backup, because that's everything. At that point, you have the entire state of your configuration of your network. Everything that was on any devices, you can just run fact collection and there it all is. Then the next thing I do, I save any of the configurations that I can to a Git repo. Then you have not only, your facts there, but you also have then an offsite backup or something like that, where you could potentially use that later to look at, what was this device a day ago, a month ago, a year ago. Or if you have to do some sort of restore, there's everything. If you need to make any changes, you could look at what that device was, a week ago and compare, do a diff. So that's what I would do. I would get started with fact collection, and I would try to get everything in your environment, get every config you possibly can and save it somewhere, and then start looking at what's there. Create templates out of it at that point.
Thank you. So going to the next question, this is seems like a same person as the prior question. The production network environment is very huge monolithic architecture he or she face, and this causing a cost to him or she, and wants to reduce the cost for the future of the operating networking environment. How do you think we can progress in this monolithic architecture to the more modern type of the network architecture? Do you have some idea around that, including the how to divide into the network layer, automating each network layer?
Sure. And this sounds very familiar with Microsoft and a few other projects that I've worked on before where, they have big, giant, massive environments, tons of network devices, and no real solid way to just, figure out exactly what is there. So, we mentioned, fact collection and all that, and then, the configuration layers. So one of the things that I've done on most projects, Microsoft included, was, at the very beginning when we were trying to figure out what needed to change, what were we doing, we talked to all of our network admins, we talked to all of our configuration SMEs, and we started building simple templates for the changes we were currently making that we could begin slowly moving our production changes over to. So instead of, whatever the existing process was, we just very slowly, change by change, started writing the Ansible version of, what would apply to that configuration, what would remediate that issue. And these things can take time. I mean, Microsoft, I know, has been on this journey for, over 3 years now. And they've made a lot of progress. Please don't get me wrong, but it's a slow effort, for a big company with a lot of complexity. It just takes time. So that's what I would suggest. I mentioned earlier, plan big, start small. Don't necessarily try to tackle everything in one go. It will take a little bit of time. But if you just, add on piece by piece, slowly, little by little, within no time, you're going to find that you can do a lot more through automation than you could just through manual processes.
Thank you. Because we do not have much time today, I think we will finish this question and answers. today. Thank you for your help from remote environment. This is very fantastic presentation, and the answers from you is very useful for the audience. Thank you. I want to see you in face-to-face near future.
One of these days. Oh.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
Yeah.
And thank you all for helping us record and everything.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.